Attention! Not for children. If you're not ready for suspense, stop now and watch something else. This story is inspired by a true event. Imagine being pulled into a nightmare in the dark, silent corners of a city, when you least expect it. Takumi was just another passenger on the subway, returning home from work. But that night the train was far from ordinary. Get ready. This is the journey of the last train.
The day had been long. Takumi Sato, 34, leaned back against the cold metal railing of the Tokyo office building, letting out a quiet sigh. His briefcase felt heavier than usual, as if it carried not just documents and reports, but the weight of the entire week. He had stayed late again as usual, finishing a project that no one would remember tomorrow. The streets were quieter than the bustling daytime. Neon lights reflected off wet asphalt, painting the city in a mix of cold blues and occasional harsh reds from passing taxis. Takumi walked briskly toward the nearest subway entrance, feeling the familiar exhaustion settle into his bones. Even in a city as crowded as Tokyo, he had grown accustomed to the strange kind of solitude that late nights bring. Most people were at home, asleep or winding down. Only a few night owls shared the streets with him. The distant hum of the train beneath the city was almost comforting, like the heartbeat of the place he had called home for years. He descended the stairs to the underground station, the echo of his shoes bouncing softly off the tiled walls. The turnstiles clinked behind him as he swiped his pass and entered the dimly lit platform. The fluorescent lights flickered occasionally, a tired reminder of the long day. The station was nearly empty. Takumi's eyes scanned the platform. A solitary man sitting on a bench, head bent over his phone, and a cleaning worker methodically mopping the floor. The hum of the fluorescent lights blended with the faint rumble of approaching trains, creating a rhythm that seemed to match Takumi's slowing heartbeat. When the train arrived, it hissed as the doors slid open. Takumi stepped inside, choosing a middle car that was almost entirely vacant. The cold metal seats pressed against his legs as he sank down, adjusting his briefcase on his lap. The smell of the train, a mix of worn plastic, faint perfume, and the metallic scent of the rails, was familiar, almost comforting, but tonight it felt slightly off, as if the air carried a secret. He noticed the few remaining passengers: an elderly man sleeping in a corner, a young woman staring blankly at her phone, and at the far end, someone he hadn't seen before. The figure was small, hunched slightly, and seemed to be watching him. Takumi squinted. The train was mostly empty, yet those dark eyes followed him every time he glanced toward that end of the car. He shook his head, convincing himself it was just fatigue, a trick of the fluorescent lights bouncing off the polished floor. As the train rumbled through the tunnels, Takumi tried to focus on the day's work he still needed to finish in his mind. But the uneasy feeling persisted. A sudden creak echoed from the ceiling, and the lights flickered again, casting long, moving shadows across the car. He blinked and leaned back, trying to ignore the tiny shivers crawling up his spine. The city above was asleep, and down here the train felt like a capsule moving through another world entirely, one where the usual rules didn't quite apply. Minutes passed, and the train continued its rhythmic stop and go through the underground labyrinth. Takumi's eyes wandered to the far end of the car again. The figure was still there, motionless, staring. For the first time he felt his pulse quicken. There was no expression on the person's face, only an empty, unsettling stillness. Takumi glanced away, forced to smile at himself in the reflection of the window, but even that small gesture did little to calm the pit in his stomach. The next station approached. The train slowed with its familiar screech, the brakes grinding lightly against the rails. Takumi rose to glance out at the platform, half expecting to see a few more night travelers, but it was empty, silent. A stray newspaper fluttered across the platform, carried by an unseen draft, and then settled. When he looked back into the car, the figure was gone. Takumi froze for a heartbeat, then shook his head again. Maybe it had been someone getting off at the previous stop. Maybe he had imagined it. He returned to his seat, adjusting his briefcase and rubbing his palms together. The city's lights above were a distant memory now, replaced by the endless dark of the tunnels. The hum of the train seemed louder, the small bumps and jerks more pronounced. Takumi's mind wandered again to his apartment, a small one-room flat, silent and empty. The thought of his warm bed and the faint smell of instant noodles waiting for him provided a small comfort, but the uneasy feeling persisted. For the first time, he noticed a small folded piece of paper on the seat beside him. He hadn't seen anyone place it there. His hand trembled slightly as he picked it up. In careful, precise handwriting, a single sentence was written. "Don't get off at the last station." Takumi stared at the paper. The words seemed impossibly simple, yet they carried a weight he couldn't explain. He glanced around the car, but it was empty. The figure had not returned. The rhythmic hum of the train continued, steady and insistent, but now it felt more ominous, like a warning. Takumi's hand tightened around the briefcase. One thought echoed in his mind, louder than the rumbles of the train. Why? And as the train sped through the darkness, Takumi realized he was no longer just heading home. Something else was moving with him, something unseen, following, waiting for the moment he made the wrong choice. Takumi's hands were cold as he held the folded paper, staring at the words again, "Don't get off at the last station." The letters seemed almost to pulse in the dim fluorescent light, and a shiver ran down his spine. He looked around the car. It was empty. The figure from before had vanished. Yet, somehow he could still feel it, an invisible presence sitting somewhere in the shadows at the far end of the train. He adjusted his briefcase on his lap, trying to force his thoughts back to the mundane. Perhaps it was fatigue. Perhaps he had imagined the eyes watching him. But the paper was real. His pulse quickened as he felt the train slow slightly for the next station. The platform outside looked empty, the usual late-night travelers nowhere in sight. A stray breeze carried a faint smell of wet asphalt from above ground, mixing with the metallic scent of the train. Takumi took a deep breath and folded the paper neatly, tucking it into the inner pocket of his jacket. He sat back, forcing his shoulders to relax. The rhythm of the train, the low hum of the rails, the distant squeak of wheels turning on curves, was familiar, and yet tonight it sounded off. Each sound seemed sharper, more pronounced, as if the tunnels themselves were listening, echoing back at him. He tried to focus on the faces of the few passengers remaining. The elderly man in the corner was now mumbling something under his breath, eyes closed, hands trembling. Takumi wondered if he had always been like that, or if the long night had worn him down in some subtle way. The young woman across the aisle stared at her phone screen, scrolling endlessly, oblivious to anything outside her device. Then his gaze shifted to the far end again. The figure had returned. This time it was closer. Takumi's stomach tightened. The person, small, hunched, was standing now just beyond the last row of seats. They were holding something in their hand, but he couldn't see what. The train's dim light reflected off a glimmer, something metallic, perhaps. Takumi's mind raced. Who were they? Why had they left the paper? And why did he feel, with a certainty he could not shake, that getting off at the last station would be a mistake of unimaginable consequence? The train jolted slightly as it approached the next stop. Takumi's reflexes told him to look away, but curiosity anchored him in place. The figure did not move from that spot. Their head tilted slightly, and though Takumi could not see a face clearly, he felt a gaze that was heavy, deliberate, and unrelenting. He could almost hear a whisper in his mind, though the car was silent except for the faint hum of machinery, "Turn back while you can." The train came to a soft halt, doors opening with a hiss. The platform was empty again, save for a single newspaper drifting across the tiles. Takumi's heart hammered as the figure stepped closer, then stopped, then vanished again as if absorbed into the shadows. The metallic clink of a coin falling somewhere in the car echoed sharply, making him flinch. He glanced at the doors. They were open. It would be so easy to get off now. And yet, something told him to stay. The seconds stretched, elastic and tense. Takumi could feel his breath against his collar, his heartbeat in his throat. He realized he had not moved, could not move, until the train began to slide forward again. Slowly, the hum of motion returned, a subtle vibration under his feet. He exhaled quietly, trying to convince himself it was all in his mind, all a trick of the lonely late-night commute. But then he noticed something else. Across the aisle, etched into the plastic seat beside him, was a small, almost imperceptible scratch, fresh-looking, like a fingernail had carved it. It read, "Don't get off." His pulse spiked again. Takumi's hand tightened around his briefcase. The reality was undeniable now. The warning, the presence, the figure, it was not imagination. Minutes passed in tense silence. Takumi kept his eyes fixed on the far end of the car, but the figure had disappeared once more. Only a faint echo of footsteps lingered in his mind, though no one was there. He forced himself to concentrate on something mundane. The hum of the train, the squeak of the brakes, the muffled announcement of the next station. But each sound, each flicker of the dim lights, made him jump, reminded him that he was not alone. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, trying to calm the racing of his heart. When he opened them again, the figure had returned, standing just beyond the seats like a shadow waiting to pounce. And then, as if sensing he was watching, it slowly raised one pale hand and gestured toward the last station. Takumi's breath caught in his chest. The paper, the scratch, the eyes, the whispering presence, it all pointed to the same terrifying truth. Getting off at the last station was no longer an idle warning. It was a command, a dire plea. As the train slid forward through the tunnels, Takumi felt a chill creep along his spine. Somewhere ahead in the darkness, a plan was forming. Something was waiting. And he knew deep down that the next few minutes could change everything. The train screeched lightly as it approached the last station. Takumi's heart thumped in his chest, each beat echoing the warning written on the mysterious paper, "Don't get off at the last station." His hands gripped the briefcase tightly, knuckles white as the final approach lights flickered across the empty tracks. Outside, the platform lay cloaked in a dim yellow haze, the flickering fluorescent bulbs barely illuminating the tiles. It was silent, too silent. The normal hum of late-night passengers, the distant cleaning carts, the occasional shuffle of shoes, none of it existed. Takumi's eyes darted around the empty car. The figure from before had disappeared once again, leaving behind only the echo of movement in his mind. He swallowed hard, trying to focus on the mechanical rhythm of the train. The low hum, the wheels grinding against the rails, the faint vibration under his feet. He told himself it was absurd, that all this tension was self-inflicted paranoia. Yet, the scratch on the seat, the note, and the uncanny presence of that figure suggested otherwise. Something waited. Something unseen. The train slowed to a near halt. Takumi's ears caught the faintest of creaks, like someone stepping carefully behind him, though the car remained empty. He turned sharply, half expecting the figure to reappear. Nothing. Only the flickering lights and the cold, metallic smell of the station greeted him. The doors opened with a hiss and a gust of stale, underground air drifted in. Takumi stood, briefcase clutched like a lifeline, and stepped cautiously onto the platform. The tiles were cold under his shoes, and a stray breeze whispered through the cavernous space, carrying with it a faint, almost imperceptible murmur. The station was vast, far larger than he remembered from the maps, almost cavernous in its emptiness. Posters hung crookedly, some peeling with age, advertisements for events long past. The silence pressed against him like a weight, and he felt the first real surge of fear since the night began. Each step he took echoed, bouncing off the tiled walls, amplifying the sensation of being watched. He paused, listening. A faint whispering reached his ears, carried perhaps by the ventilation shafts, perhaps by his own racing mind. "Turn back," it seemed to say. Takumi's breath came in shallow gasps. He glanced at the maps plastered on the walls, tracing the route he should follow to the exit. It was simple, straightforward, yet he hesitated. Every instinct screamed that this path was not right, that something was lying in wait at the end of this deserted station. He moved forward anyway, compelled by a mix of necessity and stubborn curiosity. The corridor ahead stretched long and narrow, shadows pooling in irregular patterns along the walls. As he walked, Takumi noticed the subtle, almost imperceptible signs of another presence. Footprints in the dust, a slight drag along the tiles, a flicker of movement at the edge of his vision. Every sound, the drip of water from a leaking pipe, the hum of distant machinery, seemed magnified as if conspiring to unnerve him. He forced himself to ignore it, taking steady steps, though his hand never left the briefcase. Halfway through the corridor, the lights flickered violently, plunging him briefly into near darkness. When they returned, the space ahead seemed different. The shadows had shifted. Something had moved. Takumi froze, his pulse racing. A faint, almost inaudible thud echoed somewhere ahead, like a footstep. He spun around, but the corridor behind him remained empty. A cold sweat formed at his temples. He was utterly alone, and yet not alone. The walls themselves seemed to close in, narrowing imperceptibly as he advanced. Each echo of his own footsteps mocked him, filling the cavernous space with the sound of impending doom. He forced his mind to rationalize. It's an old station. Old buildings make noises. It's the night. Nothing more. Yet the paper's warning burned in his thoughts. Don't get off. He shivered, feeling the words crawling along his spine like icy fingers. Then came the whispering again. Not faint this time. Clear. Multiple voices? No, one voice, low and deliberate, carried through the narrow corridor. You shouldn't be here. Takumi's stomach dropped. He tried to speak, to call out, but his throat felt constricted. Words caught somewhere in the cavity of his chest. He forced himself forward, each step heavier than the last, the briefcase now shaking in his grasp. A sudden metallic clang echoed nearby, and Takumi jumped, his heart hammering violently. The corridor seemed to stretch further now, impossibly long. He thought he saw a shadow flick at the corner of his eye, a figure standing, watching from the end of the hall. The figure was pale, hunched, featureless in the dim light. Takumi's pulse raced. He wanted to turn and run, but his legs refused. The pull of some unseen force propelled him forward, deeper into the shadows. Somewhere ahead, a door stood slightly ajar. Cold drafts seeped through the gap, brushing against his face, carrying the faint scent of mildew and rust. He approached cautiously, every nerve screaming. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, almost urging him backward. His hand trembled as he reached for the doorknob. The metal was icy, biting against his palm. He hesitated, heart hammering in his chest, the echo of the train's hum still resonating in his mind. Finally, with a deep breath, Takumi pushed the door open. The corridor beyond was darker still, illuminated only by faint flickers of distant lights. Shadows pooled in corners, stretching like living things. A sudden gust of wind, or something more, rushed past him carrying a faint whisper, "You cannot leave." Takumi staggered, heart leaping. The door slammed shut behind him on its own. Panic surged, but a strange, compelled calmness pushed him forward. He knew now there was no turning back. The corridor twisted unnaturally. Each corner seemed identical to the last, an endless maze. Faint, barely audible footsteps echoed behind him, keeping perfect pace with his own. Takumi dared a glance back. Nothing. Yet the sound persisted, each step closer than the last. He quickened his pace, the echo matching his every movement. Ahead, the faint outlines of photographs appeared on the walls, dim and yellowed with age. Faces stared out at him. Passengers from decades past, caught mid-step, mid-glance, frozen eternally in the corridor. As he moved closer, he noticed something chilling. The last photo, slightly tilted, showed a man who looked exactly like him. His heart seized. He staggered, reaching for the wall to steady himself. Footsteps behind him quickened. A shadow moved faster than it should, darting between the flickering lights. The whispering grew deafening in his mind, "You should not have come here." Takumi's legs burned as he ran blindly through the corridor, dodging shadows that seemed almost tangible. Every step forward felt like plunging deeper into some inescapable nightmare. At last he reached the end of the corridor. A faint light spilled from a small, partially open door. Relief surged, perhaps an exit, perhaps salvation. But as he stepped forward, the shadows behind him coalesced, forming a dark mass at the far end. The whispers rose to a chorus, chanting in unison, "You cannot leave. You cannot leave." Takumi froze, breath ragged, the briefcase slipping from his grasp. The light from the door flickered violently, and for a brief moment, the shadow seemed to surge forward, reaching, grasping. Then as quickly as it began, the sound stopped. Silence. Absolute, suffocating silence. He dared not move. Not yet. Not until he understood what had just happened. And as the corridor stretched endlessly before him, one thought consumed him entirely. He was no longer merely a man returning home from work. He was something else entirely, something caught, ensnared, trapped within the last train's final dark journey. Every instinct screamed at him to flee, to run back the way he had come, but his legs refused. It was as if the corridor itself had decided that he would not leave, that he was to witness what lay ahead. He noticed the faint outlines of walls shifting subtly, like the station itself was alive, breathing in shallow, uneven gasps. The photographs he had glimpsed before, images of passengers past, seemed to rearrange themselves, faces warping, eyes following him with uncanny precision. Takumi stepped forward, the echo of his own movement amplified tenfold by the long, narrow corridor. Each step was a test of courage. His chest tightened, lungs burning with every shallow breath. The faint whispering returned, now louder, more insistent, "You should not have come. You should not have come." The voice, or voices, were both distant and immediately close, pressing against his ears, threading through his mind. He paused before a large, rusted metal door. It bore no handle, only a small window cracked and fogged. Beyond it, faint light flickered. He knew instinctively that whatever lay behind that door was the source of all he had experienced. The shadows, the whispers, the relentless sense of being watched. His fingers trembled as he reached toward the window, brushing against the cold glass. Inside he saw a room unlike any he had imagined. The walls were lined with old photographs, meticulously arranged in a grid. Faces stared out at him, passengers he had seen on the train years ago, now frozen in time. The last row of photographs revealed the most disturbing detail. Each image showed the same corridor he had just traversed, the last train station, the same shadows lurking behind every figure. And in the center of it all, in the largest photo, was Takumi himself, looking exactly as he did now, yet the date beneath read 10 years prior. A chill ran through him. How could this be? He had only just boarded the train tonight. Yet the photograph claimed otherwise. Something in him shifted, a gnawing realization. He was not merely traveling home. He was part of a cycle, trapped within a temporal loop, a nightmare that had been waiting for him long before he ever stepped onto the train. Suddenly, the faint hum of the train echoed through the room, though he was far from the tracks. The door behind him rattled violently. Shadows spilled through the cracks, forming tendrils of darkness that stretched toward him, cold and alive. Takumi stumbled backward, heart hammering, briefcase falling to the floor with a heavy clang. He pressed himself against the wall, trying to make sense of what was happening. The whispers intensified, now overlapping, creating a low, droning chant. "You cannot leave. You cannot leave. You are ours." Takumi's mind raced. Panic threatened to consume him, but beneath the fear was a sharp clarity. He needed to understand, to find a way out, or he would be claimed entirely. His gaze swept the room, searching desperately for anything, any object, any hint, that could serve as a lifeline. One thing stood out, a small, open notebook lying on a dusty shelf. Takumi approached it, hands trembling. The pages were filled with notes, diagrams, and dates. Accounts of passengers trapped in the same station, the same corridor, over decades. Each entry ended with a warning identical to the one he had received. "Do not get off. Do not return." Takumi's eyes widened. This was no accident, no coincidence. The train, the station, the shadows, they were part of something older, something that fed on those who failed to heed the warnings. And he had failed. A sudden movement caught his eye. From the corner of the room, a shadow detached itself from the darkness. It moved with unnatural speed, yet its form was indistinct, almost fluid. Takumi backed away, heart racing, until his shoulder hit the wall. The shadow paused, then stretched toward him, tendrils brushing against his coat, cold and electric. He realized with growing horror that the shadows were not merely following, they were guiding. Each movement seemed deliberate, steering him toward a narrow passage in the far wall of the room. Against his better judgment, against every instinct screaming to run, Takumi stepped toward it. The passage led to a staircase descending into absolute darkness. The air grew colder with each step. His breath formed small clouds in the dim light. The walls were damp, slick with condensation, and the faint whispers now seemed to emanate from the very stones themselves. Takumi's pulse was deafening in his ears. He tried to stop, to turn back, but the shadows pressed forward behind him, leaving no room for retreat. At the bottom of the staircase, he entered a cavernous chamber. The scale of it was beyond comprehension. Trenches of darkness intertwined with patches of flickering light, creating an impossible maze. And in the center, a figure waited. Tall, faceless, radiating a presence that seemed to absorb the light around it. Takumi's stomach turned, but he could not look away. The faceless figure extended one arm, pointing toward an archway at the far end. Takumi understood instinctively that this was his path, the final choice. Step through and perhaps he might survive. Refuse and he would become another face on the wall, another warning for the next traveler. He hesitated. Memories of the city above ground, of his small apartment, of the warmth of a bed and the comfort of routine, flashed through his mind. But the shadows were patient, relentless. A whisper, soft but unmistakable, cut through his hesitation. "You belong here now, or you will be remembered." Summoning every ounce of courage, Takumi stepped forward. Each step resonated through the chamber, echoing like a drumbeat. The faceless figure did not move, only watched. The archway grew closer, the flickering light brighter, and for a moment he felt a surge of hope. Perhaps he could escape this endless nightmare. But as his hand reached for the archway, the shadows surged, not violently but deliberately, enveloping him. The air thickened and the whispering grew deafening. Takumi's vision blurred, reality twisting around him. The last thing he saw before the darkness swallowed him entirely was the corridor behind him, stretching endlessly, lined with photographs of those who had come before, and now including him. Time seemed to stretch and collapse simultaneously. He felt neither weight nor gravity, only the relentless pull of something ancient, aware, patient. And then, in the silence that followed, a single thought anchored itself in his mind. He would ride the last train forever. The room at the end of the corridor waited, and now so did he.